Tonight on Newswatch, crisis in Ukraine. A look ahead at this weekend's critical vote in Crimea. Plus, theories over that missing Malaysian plane. How new information is expanding the search for Flight 370. And why winning the White House in 2016 may rely on winning the Cuban vote. All this and more tonight on Newswatch. Good evening. I'm Mark Martin. Secretary of State John Kerry met with Russia's foreign minister today in London, but that meeting did little to ease tensions between the West and Russia over the crisis in Ukraine. On Sunday, voters in the Crimean Peninsula will decide whether to remain part of the country or to split and join Russia. The West has said it won't recognize the vote. George Thomas has the story.
From the corridors of Washington,
we have been very firm in saying that we will stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
To Berlin, Germany.
One thing has to be absolutely clear. The territorial integrity of Ukraine is not up for discussion.
To Kiev, Ukraine.
We fight for our freedom, we fight for our independence, we fight for our sovereignty, and we will never surrender.
Western leaders are warning Russia to change course in Crimea or face consequences.
We call on Russia to cease all preparations for the annexation of Crimea.
But the tough words are having little impact as Russia's grip tightens by the day. Some 20,000 forces have now fanned out across the Crimean Peninsula ahead of Sunday's referendum vote. And this idea of holding a constitutional referendum on whether Crimea should be part of Russia or Ukraine is extremely controversial here on the streets of Kiev. Most folks are dead set against it.
In all likelihood, they will vote to join Russia, but it will be an illegal vote.
There is strength in unity, but this issue is dividing us, and this is not good.
The U.S. has placed visa bans and frozen financial assets of Russian officials responsible for violating Ukraine's sovereignty, and more potential sanctions could be on the way.
It can get ugly fast if the wrong choices are made.
Adding to tensions, Russia is holding another round of military exercises along Ukraine's eastern border, involving thousands of troops. This as Kiev's new government votes to form a 60,000-man military force to boost its country's defenses against a potential full-scale Russian invasion.
And George is just back from Ukraine. He joins us now with more. George, most people do not know that there's a large Muslim population in Crimea. How are they going to vote on Sunday's referendum?
Yeah, absolutely. They are called the Muslim Tatars. They basically make up about 12% of the Crimean Peninsula. And they have, in the last few weeks, banded with the non-Russian speaking residents of Crimea to, in essence, push back against any possible annexation and joining with Russia. They have stood for many, many years against Russian occupation.
Now, there were reports earlier this week that the Muslim Tatars who fought alongside al-Qaeda in Syria are back in Crimea, ready to fight against the Russians.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you know, that's my big concern. My concern is that Crimea becomes another Chechnya, becomes another Dagestan. In essence, the Muslim Tatars remember what Joseph Stalin did to them back in 1944. In essence, drove out the Muslims out of Russia, sent them to Siberia. They experienced tremendous persecution, and the folks who have fought in Syria against with al-Qaeda against Bashar al-Assad, they've come back and said to the Muslim Tatars of Crimea, listen, we don't want to be under the tutelage, under the dominion of Russians. We've got to fight back. And my concern is that you could see, not in the immediate future, but down the road, a potential Islamic insurrection against the Russian forces.
Interesting. Well, George, you have been saying all along that Russia is looking beyond Crimea. What is their next target?
Absolutely. I mean, the day I landed in Ukraine 2 weeks ago, I knew right away, having visited Crimea, that the Russians, Vladimir Putin, is seeing his influence beyond just the Crimean Peninsula. He wants to go and, look at the eastern part of the country. There are close to between 20 to 80,000 Russian forces who are literally marked 30 miles from the Ukrainian border. And my concern is that they will just literally waltz across the border and invade the eastern as well as the southern part of Ukraine.
Well, it's disturbing. Well, U.S. and Russia held high-level talks in London today. What went on?
In essence, John Kerry, after 6 hours of meeting with his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, came out of the conference and said, we had frank discussions. They were very, very intense. That's diplomatic speak, Mark, for in essence, we agreed on nothing. Basically, this was a last-minute attempt to try and bring some kind of a resolution, but they walked away, went back to their capitals, nothing being resolved. Very, very tight on edge in this part of the world.
Okay, our senior international correspondent, George Thomas, thanks for staying on top of this.
You're welcome, sir.
All right, I know a lot more to come.
Yes.
In other news, close to 1 million Ukrainian Americans are closely watching the latest developments in their home country and have plenty of concerns about Sunday's referendum. Heather Sells has that story.
Olya Zaporozhets checks the Ukrainian press several times a day.
This is the country that is in my heart. This is the most dearest country to me. It's my home.
Although her parents live just a few hours from the border of Crimea, Zaporozhets says she doesn't fear for their safety, at least not right now. But Irina Levtarova does fear for her brother, who lives in Kiev.
He's my only sibling. I worry about him being in front of the special forces. I'm worried about him doing something very heroic and getting injured or worse.
For many Ukrainians, the current conflict brings fears of history repeating itself, of times past when borders were disregarded and minor disagreements escalated.
Nobody in 1853 thought an argument between the Tsar of Russia and the new president of France, Napoleon III, over who had the keys to the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem would manifest in a war that led to the death of 500,000 people.
Even so, says Zaporozhets, Russia's invasion of Crimea caught many off guard.
None of us, I guess, could truly believe that Russia would attack us because we've always been thinking of us as brother nations and people who fought World War together, who developed our countries together, rebuilt our countries, remarried. There are so many connections.
Like many Ukrainians, Zaporozhets sees Sunday's referendum as carefully staged, the outcome predetermined. And as many in the West fear, she believes Putin will not stop with Crimea.
He wants to fight. He wants the entire Ukraine territory. He wants it being subdued to Russia.
Dmitry Litovsky protested against the Soviet Union in the 1990s before he moved to the U.S. Today, he believes Russia is headed towards fascism.
Their signs are right there. Annexing Ukraine, controlling media, replacing communism with nationalism, and persecuting minorities.
For Litovsky, Zaporozhets, and other Ukrainian Americans, it's a time of great concern. And despite social media and other technology connecting them to Ukraine, the conflict remains one they can only watch from afar. Heather Sells, CBN News.
As the important vote takes place in Crimea, CBN News will be working to bring you the very latest information over the weekend. Make sure you check out cbnnews.com for updates. There's new evidence showing the disappearance of that Malaysian plane may not have been an accident. Officials say the information suggests the plane was in the air hours after they lost contact, and now search teams are widening their scope. Caitlin Burke has the story.
The search zone has expanded yet again in what's quickly becoming the most expensive aviation investigation ever. Still, authorities have few clues about where the Malaysian Airlines plane is or why it vanished.
We haven't found the aircraft with all the resources that are currently searching for the aircraft by the end of a week. Then comes a second question, which is how long may it take us to find the aircraft? That could be an extended period.
The plane's been missing since early last Saturday. Now some aviation experts say that mounting evidence shows that its disappearance was most likely not an accident. Late Thursday night, ABC News quoted two unidentified American officials saying the U.S. believes the plane's two communication systems were shut down separately. That would mean the plane didn't disappear because of some kind of mechanical failure. The possibilities of what did actually happen keep growing, including the chances that a pilot wanted to commit suicide or someone with flying experience wanted to hijack the plane for a later purpose.
New information, an additional search area may be opened in the Indian Ocean.
Authorities say they have several pings from the airline's service data system in the 4 to 5 hours after the last transponder signal. That indicates the plane was still in the air, possibly putting it over the Indian Ocean rather than between Malaysia and Vietnam. A U.S. destroyer is being moved into the Indian Ocean to begin a search in that area. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Crews are still cleaning up debris from the site of Wednesday's gas explosion in East Harlem. 8 people are confirmed dead after it leveled 2 buildings. Meanwhile, New York City pastors are rallying around an evangelical church that lost everything in the blast. Spanish Christian Church occupied the first floor of one of the destroyed buildings. Ministers from across the city began holding round-the-clock prayer vigils Thursday morning. They're being led by Bronx pastor William Devlin. He told CBN News why the effort is important.
We've all gathered together to support Pastor Thomas Perez. He's an older gentleman in his 70s. The church had been there for 80 years. And they've really been salt and light in the community here in East Harlem. The pastor is very concerned just about the future of the church and what it's going to mean for him and where it's going to go.
Pastor Thomas Perez says his congregation does plan to rebuild. Around 20 of the church's 60 members lived in the destroyed building and are now homeless. Coming up, meet a man who lost his memory and is now trying to rediscover life. Welcome back. Congress is taking a look at how to protect young athletes from head injuries. A recent study finds during a season, a young football player will take an average of 650 hits to the head. Wow, posing a great risk of concussion. And it's not just the violent game of football. Girls soccer has the second highest number of head injuries reported. Former Team USA goalie Brianna Scurry knows the dangers of such injuries firsthand.
I still have issues with my balance, loss of memory, concentration, difficulty focusing, sensitivity to light and sound.
Most kids don't know how to head the ball properly anyway at the really young age. They really need to be taught how to do it well.
Congress is calling for safer equipment and a change to the win-at-all-cost culture of many sports. Head injuries sustained while young could affect you later in life, and that's exactly what happened to Scott Bolzen. He woke up one day not knowing who he was, and doctors say his amnesia is probably permanent. Lori Johnson has his story.
Scott Bolzen should be looking back on a life well lived, a happy childhood, marriage to a loving wife, 2 great kids, and a career as a professional football player, then a pilot and the owner of a private jet company. The problem is he doesn't remember any of it.
I've lost my identity. I've lost who I was because I don't know what I stood for. I don't know what my goals were, my dreams.
In 2008, Scott slipped on some grease in the bathroom at work and hit his head, erasing his 46 years of memories. His amazing story is detailed in his book, My Life Deleted. In it, he describes waking up in the hospital, not knowing his wife or even the meaning of the word.
Like when the first time I saw Joan, they said, you must be Joan, Scott's wife. So boom, wife, Joan, her.
Scott has what's known as retrograde amnesia, which means he remembers everything since the accident, but almost nothing from before it. The problem is lack of blood flow to the front part of the brain, where long-term memories are stored. Since his accident, Scott is relearning all the things most of us take for granted, thanks to Google, TV, and Joan.
I could not get the days of the week, the months of the year. I knew them, but I couldn't get them in order.
Scott forgot his Christian faith, so Joan's telling him about Jesus all over again.
Trying to teach him about the Lord and faith, I just tried to show him God's awesomeness through our world. And, there is a Lord, there is a bigger person that is not only watching over us, but creating such amazing and awesome opportunities.
Doctors are trying to stimulate blood flow in Scott's brain with hyperbaric oxygen therapy, but it's a long shot.
They kind of feel that those memories are there, that they're encoded in him, but he can't actively retrieve them.
Most people who have a traumatic brain injury, which is a really, really common cause for amnesia, will usually recover the memory 30 minutes, next day. That's common. To have it this profound is unusual.
Neurologist Jacqueline Carter believes part of Scott's problem is that back when he played football, head injuries weren't taken as seriously as they are today.
Well, we've learned over the years that people who have played hockey, football, sports that give you contact are more prone to develop memory problems, including early onset Alzheimer's disease. So it is quite possible that his career as a football player, pros, high school, college, could have contributed to the profoundness of his injury. We also have learned that the more injuries you have to the brain or the more concussions you have, they become cumulative and the more damage they do.
Currently, most states have laws requiring athletes with concussions to get medical help and rest until they're fully recovered, which can be a week or so. But players who don't want to be sidelined that long may try to downplay an injury. So it's important for parents and coaches to recognize the signs, such as headache, nausea, dizziness, confusion, sluggishness, and personality changes. Also vision problems and sensitivity to light or noise. Meanwhile, Scott and Joan concentrate on moving forward rather than dwelling on how they got here, which they recommend to anyone going through a crisis.
Our message is basically whatever life brings, look for opportunity.
To trust in God and grow.
I think the positive part is that I've gotten to fall in love with my wife again.
So instead of focusing on what's lost, they're starting a lifetime of new memories. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Up next, why a new generation of Cubans could be leaning away from the conservative movement. This week in Florida, a Republican candidate won an important special election. Over the years, the GOP has had a lock on Cuban voters in that state, but now that could change. Heather Sells has tonight's Focus Report.
More than 800,000 Cubans live in South Florida. You'll find them sipping small cups of strong coffee throughout the day and helping drive the local economy in upscale shopping and business districts. And in what's known as Little Havana, the older crowd flocks to Domino Park, rain or shine.
For years, the GOP has depended on Cubans in Miami as a reliable vote. But now, the younger generation doesn't appear to share the same party loyalty or political concerns.
The older, the exile community that came in 59 and in the 60s was more focused on a real single mission, which was getting back to Cuba.
Jose Fuentes' dad emigrated from Cuba, so he speaks personally about younger Cubans. As a government lobbyist, Fuentes also speaks professionally and says young Cubans born here bring a different set of values to the table.
We want to hear that you've got a good tax code that helps working families. We want to know that you're doing better things for education.
New polling shows a political divide among Cuban Americans, with the younger generation less concerned about Cuban policy and more motivated by domestic issues. It makes sense to Al Cardenas, chair of the American Conservative Union.
Cuban Americans, when we first came to America, said, look, Republicans are against communism, they're for liberty, they're for freedom, we're with them. Now, they like what Republicans stand for, but they're also looking closely at the individuals and what they stand for.
That may explain why in 2012, Joe Garcia became Florida's first Cuban-American Democrat elected to Congress, why a record number of Cuban voters turned out for President Obama, and why those like J.C. Dare feel more liberal than their Cuban-born parents.
I consider myself in the moderate world. Not, most Cuban Americans are a bit conservative and so on. I consider myself in the moderate.
Political watchers call it a subtle shift that is worth watching. Latin American expert and Regent Provost Paul Bonicelli believes that Republicans should be concerned.
The first shock for the GOP is they never had to worry about that, and now you have to. And it's not just worry like keep me up at night, it's now I got to spend more money in an area that was a lock.
Here's the political equation. Cubans are key to Florida's Hispanic vote. Florida's Hispanic vote is critical to winning the state, and the state leads to the White House. Florida's 29 electoral votes are the fourth most in the country and make it a major battleground state. In addition to their impact on voting, younger Cubans could ultimately affect U.S. policy towards Cuba.
I think the younger generation looks at the embargo as something that maybe hasn't functioned, maybe we should change it, maybe we should negotiate.
And they're like a lot of younger Americans. They don't really listen so much to their parents and grandparents and what they're talking about. They want to strike out on their own. They want to have a different point of view. And that explains a lot of the apathy toward the anti-Castro movement.
Part of that turnaround can be seen in this recent poll showing 64% in Miami want normal relations between the U.S. and Cuba. Maybe that's why this handshake with Raul Castro at Nelson Mandela's memorial didn't make more waves than it would have in the past. For now, the Cuban vote remains one in transition, representing a newfound opportunity for Democrats and a new concern for the GOP. Reporting in Miami, Heather Sells, CBN News.
Up next, see how Operation Blessing is working to bring aid to fishermen in Haiti. Operation Blessing is bringing relief to an impoverished community in Haiti. Maydon Belize is a village located next to Lake Osway, where many families make their livelihood as fishermen. But years of fishing have left the lake depleted and families struggling to make ends meet. Operation Blessing is restocking that and other lakes all over Haiti with millions of baby tilapia, providing them with a source of food and income. And teams also helped build a new school where children are receiving an education as well as daily breakfast and lunch. Boy, Operation Blessing is amazing. It seems like they're everywhere, always doing good. Remember, you can email us your comments and questions at newswatch@cbn.com. Hope you'll join us next time and have a great weekend.